My name is Emily Moses, and I'm volunteering as the session moderator today. Thank you for joining our Zoom meeting, Taking Rubrics Home. We invite you to turn on your camera if you are comfortable and able to join with video during Q&A and conversations. To minimize background noise, we ask that everyone stay on mute when not talking. If you would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand feature in the participants tab, and you're also invited to submit your questions via the chat. If you're having any tech or connectivity issues with the event software, please utilize the Chrome browser. It may also be helpful to follow the direct Zoom meeting invite, which is in the session description. And now I will turn it over to our session presenter, David Grant.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. And hello, Holly and Corey. I can see you. Thanks for being on video. I think we have another 5 or so folks who are just listening. There are going to be a couple times where I'm going to hope to assemble as much of the group where we can see each other as possible. I'll tell you when those will be. I'm going to share my screen right away and give a couple of introductory remarks, and then move back to a gallery view where I hope at least several of us can talk to each other. Here's the we go with the session, Taking Rubrics Home. And I just like to pause over it because there are really kind of two ideas here. One is about taking rubrics. and I have some thoughts about people who are enjoying working with rubrics and how to share them specifically with others back at home. But there's another idea in our title, which is almost taking anything home. How do you, particularly if you go to a conference, you get an idea, you're pretty eager and you want to head home, and it's almost typical that people avoid you till you calm down. They just don't have the bandwidth to take on your enthusiasm. So we're going to talk about both those ideas. Both ideas about what are you taking anything home, and then specifically taking rubrics home. I'm going to start, as I did on Tuesday, with this just reminder that all of us are engaged in this translation of our why, our purpose, our sense of sort of why we exist in the world and why our efforts are worthy. The journey between the why and the what. The what is what happens in the world, and sometimes it's highly effective, sometimes it flounders a bit, and of course the reason it is effective when it's effective is that we get the why right. That we get the how right, the middle circle, the how that aims us toward continuous improvement in all that we do. And interestingly, one of the tools for continuous improvement is the rubric. So I'm assuming that everybody who's decided to come to this session is at least interested in rubrics, whether or not you have a lot of experience. At some point when you're interested in rubrics, this simple matrix in front of you becomes almost magic. It becomes sort of so compelling because you realize that anything that matters to you, if you put it in that left-hand column, what you're saying is, I want to unpack this, and I want to unpack it with my colleagues. I want to describe along a spectrum what we mean by success and help shape our own performance as a group, as individuals, as a team in the years and months ahead. The matrix allows you a chance to have that conversation, and it literally holds it for you, as in contains it, while you go about your busy lives. There's so many of these questions that never have an end to them, and we need to come back to them. And when we come back to a rubric that contains our best thinking and has the word draft on top, we can pick up where we left off. And so you start to think about, in some ways, with this session, we're going to be writing an informal rubric about taking rubrics home. What does it look like to do it well? What would success look like for you? But I think throughout this summit, we've had examples of important ideas where rubrics can help us capture and share what we're learning. Yesterday's session about the Winston-Salem art project. If you're thinking about a public art project in the era of Black Lives Matter, there were some lessons there for us, and some rows of the rubric that had to do with collaboration, that had to do with who's in charge. There are lessons that we can capture. And if we write draft at the top, we're not saying here's the answer for all time. We're saying we're welcoming people into conversations. I think the session on boards yesterday, if you were writing a rubric on your board, and imagine the traits and criteria that you might have, and you might have a trait over there about being ambassadors in the community, and you'd unpack that in ways that would affect how people did it. What we had was a masterclass in if we had a row on boards doing their part for creating an anti-racist organization. At the top of the rubric, we had a list of to-dos there from that presentation that if we can somehow manage to take them home, whether or not they're in the form of a rubric, we've changed the way our organization acts. I wanted to make a sort of a simple point and share something that the folks who were with me on Tuesday saw, but I love it so much I want to share it with you again, and that is that my friend Michelle Knappick sent me a rubric a couple of weeks ago, and it was on the occasion of my 70th birthday, and she thinks in terms of rubrics, and so she wrote one, or not wrote a full rubric, she constructed one called the Blissful and Stout-Hearted Septuagenarian. And she wrote draft because she understands that rubrics work in certain ways. And then here it was, that all these elements of your life in your 70s, family, friends, community, nature, health, intergenerational connections, that they all may or may not be important to you, and you may want to unpack them along a spectrum. And you see, or the low part of her spectrum was retirement gloom, which of course can be very vivid if for people who are retired. But the top of the rubric invites you to dream. It invites you to be a visionary and to think about pure abundance in any of those areas. What a gift. Now, one of the simple lessons about taking rubrics home is embodied in what Michelle did for me, which is that she sent me the structure of a rubric and she didn't fill it out because she knows I'm the one who needs to fill it out. And she basically said, this is the kind of thing I know you would love to play with. Happy birthday. And my reaction to it may be indicative of what some of your colleagues back home might do if you put the right outline of a rubric in front of them. Don't fill it out. Don't say, here's my rubric, here are the answers. Why don't you say, here are some important things. And here's a sense of a spectrum of success. What do you think? Just that simple act can pull people in and allow you to take rubrics home until people are saying, wait a minute, we're not finished. We're not finished. And you go, write draft on the top and we'll come back to it. So I'm going to pause in a minute and come back to gallery view, because I'd like to pose this question before we do anything else, which is for you, what are the issues or the challenges with taking rubrics home? And if you can either write something in the chat, or as we come back, and I really invite the non-video participants to join us on video for a couple of minutes. And you could just wave at me or wave your hand if you have something to say here. But I'd love to know what's on your mind and what you'd hope to learn or get out of this session.
David, you unmuted. Did you have a question?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. Does anyone have a question? Mohammed, You have any questions? Corey, Holly?
If
I
you
have
if you
questions, but
I'm sorry.
but I have questions for myself, but I don't want to dominate the conversation.
So let's see if others do first, and then Emily, happy to take your question.
I have a quick question, Emily and David, if that's all right. This is Mohammed.
Yes.
David, we've spoken once. I'm from Center for Whole Communities. Yeah, I know a lot about rubrics, and I've worked with them. You know, the question I have is, I love that idea of like a rubric as a kind of container for conversations.
Yes.
And then sometimes people's eyes glaze over when you show them a rubric, especially the fully completed rubric. And at times I've wanted to find other metaphors along that line of a container, or like other images or structures, especially in the realm of arts, of like what, and I'm curious if you've ever done something like that or seen it, where like, is there a piece of art that can also help people see like, oh, this is just a container for a conversation. So I'm curious, like, when can we put the matrix down, right, as a kind of structure, and inspire folks with other structures? Because that piece feels so important, but sometimes kind of elusive, the container idea.
You know, thanks, Mohammed. I'm not surprised that you'd be, you know, I'm think you and like I have worked with a lot of groups on rubrics, and sometimes it really slows down because people feel overwhelmed. And I would say that one thing I've learned is that a blank rubric is a lot better than a filled out rubric, and until people are completely into it. When they're into it, they love to know what other people would think to put in the rubric. I've urged that for the last several years with Artists Thrive, is to use the outlines of the I'm an artist, I work with artists, and in the areas, and then ask people what they would put, and then say, and would you be interested in what 5 or 6 people decided to put in this box after working on it for a year and a half? Most of them go, yeah, I would be interested. The other thing, Mohammed, is that visually, I've seen some rubrics that just use artwork to evoke the spectrum, from sort of grim images to ones that are more about abundance. And you can't get around the fact, though, that once you have a matrix and once you start to fill it out, anybody who's leading a busy life some part of them says, I don't have room for this. And I would say the other thing I've done is just simply focus on the question the rubric asks, which is, in this area. Let me go back to that board example for a minute. Every board, I think, at some point or another, should ask the question, what does it look like to be an ambassador for this organization? Just ask the question and get that answer to where you're feeling really good about it. And then you could put that answer in the rubric and say, we've begun to construct this rubric. And it invites us actually to say, and what would disappoint us? And what do we want to avoid? That's the low part of the rubric. And then my favorite question is, after people have done a pretty good job of answering what success would look like, to ask them, what would it really look like? That's the top of the rubric. And when people are sort of already into it, oh, I get it, I see what we're doing now, they can imagine something they haven't seen yet, and have a belief they can work backwards from it. Let's see if Holly, what was you want to go online for a minute? I mean, go off, unmute and talk.
So I think this is similar to what Mohammed brought up in terms of being overwhelmed by this concept. I love the matrix, but it seems like in the world I work in, there's always an emergency, there's always a fire. And people are constantly just running from one urgent item to the next. And in that environment, it can be difficult to get into that planning quadrant.
Yes. Where
you have the mind space and the capacity to do this well.
There you go. I mean, if I had to list the sort of important insights in this work in some order, that would probably be number one to me, is that you can't even do this work without creating the time for it. And that's cultural. I'm gonna actually talk about that in a later slide. But I got to the point when I'd be working with organizations, if they wanted all the benefits of rubrics without setting aside the time to do them, I'd just say, forget it, and forget about me. I'm not working with you. Because, I mean, talk about something where you just set people up for frustration. So let's just, anybody else before we go back? I have some, slides. I want to share some thoughts, but anybody else? Avery, Corey, you all right? Okay, good. Then let me, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Here we go. And then I'm going to kind of give you some of my own answers or my own thoughts about this issue and locate them in this iceberg slide, which a number of you have seen. I think it's so valuable, just knowing that what's happening above the water there, events that we see and patterns in our own work and our organizations and our colleagues in the world and society. All of them are shaped and determined by things that are invisible, that are underwater. The patterns of behavior and trends that are sort of, secretly shaping things. The systems, structures, which are not so secretly shaping things, the systems we are in. And you know how the phrase is, systems get the results they're designed to get? Well, we're often in systems that we didn't design, and we get frustrated because we're not getting the results we want. And if we go underwater and say, maybe we need some systems change here, then we're getting somewhere. But the biggest leverage of all is deep underwater. It's mental models. It's about values and assumptions and beliefs that shape the systems that we're in, that then shape our patterns of behavior and determine events. So, my question is, the question I pose for this session is, well, what are the mental models that could help us take rubrics home? And I came up with 3 things that I wanted to talk to you about in the rather limited time we have. And they are how we think about design, how we think about culture and the importance of culture, and how we think about change. Now, these are big ideas, right? these as nouns could take us in a lot of different directions. I'm going to be as succinct as I can on how I think they affect the whole notion of taking rubrics home. And let's start with design. My goal is, what I'd like to do here is I'd like to talk about design and culture and then take a little break and see what your reactions are, any stories, any questions, and then end with just a little musing about change and how difficult it is, but what we can do about it. So let's realize that rubrics are design work, but in some ways they are the tools that help us design what's important. It's not that the rubric's the point. The rubric is a tool that helps us design mission-based work in the world. And it's helpful to know what's the ingredients about design thinking. Here's a little scheme that I found really helpful, which is that there are 3 elements of design. This comes from Tim Brown's book, Change by Design, where he says the 3 elements, is the kind of core element is desirability. You wouldn't design something that wasn't desirable, that you didn't want to have in the world. So what is it we're designing? What's desirable here? And just saying this would be desirable doesn't bring it about, of course. You need 2 other elements of design to bring it into the world. And one is feasibility, which has to do with making it possible. This has to do with capacity. And the third is viability, which has to do with money. We know what we want, desirability. We try to make it possible, build with capacity to do it ourselves and others. And then we need to be sure we can afford it, viability. So these 3 circles all need to be part of thinking about any mission-based work. And of course, even with individual artists, we don't need to use organization speak. What's desirable is a sort of a way to sustain a practice of art making. So what's the relationship between this and rubrics? There's no better way, in my experience, to define specifically desirability than a rubric, because it keeps asking you to be more specific, and it keeps inviting others to be part of a conversation about what are we after here? In this area, what is important? What is our vision of success, and not just of success, of great, overwhelming success? What is it? So desirability, when there's a process to define it that brings others in, automatically pulls the feasibility circle over, because there are more people who are in on it, there are more people who care about it, there are more people who are willing to bring their own capacity to achieving this desirability. I used to say when I ran a foundation that all we were looking for from our grantees was clarity about what they wanted to do. And then a case that they, whether or not they're working with others, often working with others, had the capacity to bring it about. And then the viability circle comes right over, because that's what funders are looking for. And so we all have our own individual sort of variations of this, but just reminding ourselves that it all rests on the strength of that desirability circle and the process of defining it. And again, the rubric is a spectacular tool for doing both those things. If you're coming back to others with a rubric and they're holding their head, remind them you're not trying to make their life miserable or confuse them with some strange document. You are trying to, with them, define what's most desirable for them, as well as you and all your colleagues and the people you serve. And so the rubric as a tool for design is really an important mental model that bubbles up. And then I would say that the other part of design thinking that's important is, and all artists know this, is that you have to deliberately have these phases of divergent thinking followed by convergent thinking. Divergent thinking, let's just open and wide here. Convergent thinking, let's narrow down. Divergent thinking is about creating choices. Convergent thinking is about making choices. And you could go, oh yeah, that's good. And if only it were this simple, where somebody blew a whistle and said, okay, we've created enough choices now we're going to make choices. Okay, we're done. There's a lovely book called The Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision-Making by Sam Kainer. And he makes this wonderful point, which is that between the divergent zone and the convergent zone lies the grown zone. I would say that second only to the mission time idea that we're going to talk about, was mentioned earlier and we're going to talk about later, the grown zone as a concept is liberating. And it reminds groups of things that artists know. Artists almost always struggle when they've done all their divergent thinking. They go through a grown zone of making choices, of getting to what is this going to be like? How am I, what is it I'm creating here? Well, groups avoid the grown zone because they think it's about conflict. They think it's about disagreement and it's unpleasantness. No, it's about getting to the end of a decision that matters. And so if groups in their collective mental model had an idea that, okay, I know we're not done, we haven't been through the grown zone, or we're in the grown zone right now, we must be making progress, then they're like design thinkers. And a number of the groups I've worked with over time, I mean, I even have people who will send me notes the next morning and just describe being in the grown zone and how much they appreciated being able to name it, that they were in the grown zone. Okay. now let's just talk about culture for a minute, because I think many of you are familiar with this statement that culture eats strategy for lunch. Is that you can be as strategic as possible and then throw your hands up because nothing gets done. And it's because of the culture of organizations, certainly, but we work on multiple different levels. There are cultures in families, there are cultures in friendships, there are cultures in organizations and in civic bodies and the like. And so I'd like to ask you all, your thoughts, or share with you my thoughts about what is a culture of high performance. Remember, we're back to this idea of the how, is that if we have an approach to the how of bringing about high performance, we are better off. And I found this really interesting. I actually participated in this national project called the LEAP Ambassadors, where they define high performance, as you see on your screen, the ability to deliver over a prolonged period of time, meaningful, measurable, and financially sustainable results for the people or causes the organization is in existence to serve. And you go, okay, I'll buy that. Now what do I do? And their answer for me is revealing, and it actually has some real bearing on this question of taking rubrics home, because they say that there are 7 pillars of high performance. And any of you who are involved with organizations or run them, you'll recognize the first 4 here, which has to do with certain kind of leadership, certain kind of management, kind of program design, and overall financial health and sustainability. All of these can be unpacked, and they are on the LEAP Ambassador website if you're interested in that. But it's pillars 5 and 6 that most interest me, and I think are most important here. Pillar 5 is a culture that values learning. I've never heard an organization say they don't value learning. But when I follow up and I say, well, show me how you value learning, you kind of go, well, we just do. We're those kind of folks. And I say, deep underwater, if you haven't created systems that allow you to value learning, you're not above water doing the kind of learning you think you are, or that you say you want to. Interestingly, one of the keys to learning is pillar 6, which is internal monitoring for continuous improvement. Do you see what that is? That's assessment. That's internal assessment. That's rubrics. So that one of the pillars of high performance has to do with what rubrics represent, which is an approach to formative assessment that keeps you constantly improving, as opposed to letting all the assessment come from your donors or the government or whoever's doing it. Their 7th pillar often only applies to actually fairly large organizations, which is external evaluation. I look at that and I go, you know what? I don't need to hire McKinsey. I can have a focus group. I can call a few people up and I can be sure that we're always listening to the people who are affected by our work. So for me, the takeaway here is that this national group, after working on this for years, has identified internal monitoring for continuous improvement as one of the pillars of high performance. And if we understand that it is the pillar that allows us to get the first 4 pillars right, a culture that is constantly asking, well, what does courageous and adaptive leadership look like for our board, for our executive leaders, for our board leaders? What does disciplined, people-focused management look like? If we have a culture that is asking those questions and has a tool to kind of revisit our answers, we're going to get way closer than if we don't. And that becomes the core of our learning, because you can't do all those things above without learning, studying together, discussing, listening to others. You have a culture that makes learning not only about what they do in the world, but about how to do it as an organization. If you make those 2 ideas key, it changes everything you do above water. So I go back to the notion that was hinted at earlier that it's impossible to do that without making time to do it. And that Covey's matrix, after all these years, is still so sturdy in helping us realize that we spend most of our time reacting to things that are urgent. And I mean, Covey wrote his book. He wrote this matrix before there were cell phones. He wrote it before we were all on laptops, before we were all accessible to everybody we'd ever met in the world, and people who had never met us but were trying to get a piece of us. The running an organization, we're almost doing anything these days. We do it in quadrant 1. We're lucky, those of us in the arts and in the social sector, to be doing important work. But when it feels urgent and often late, it's a burnout quadrant. And when we're not there, we're often in quadrant 3, where we're doing things that are not important to us, but are urgent for others. And that's the frustrating quadrant. And between burnout and frustration, that describes a lot of the leadership in the whole civic sector, social sector. And Covey's point, of course, is the beauty of quadrant 2. If only we could do the things that are important to us in a non-urgent way more often, it would save us time in quadrant 1. It would keep us out of quadrant 3. It would make our lives more manageable. This little sliver of time we have together, this 50 minutes we have together, are actually quadrant 2 time. They're mission time. Important matters. It's not urgent. You don't have to be here. You could be somewhere else. Your emails are piling up. But you know what? My goal would be that you take an idea from this session, even if it's one idea, and you take it back to where you live over there in quadrant 1, where things are important and urgent, and it actually makes life a little easier. Let's just we're going to take a break for comments or observations, stories, questions. Any reactions to those first 2 ideas about design and about culture? Yeah, Corey.
Yeah, one of the the things that it brings up a story that I heard from my former supervisor at an art museum, and she used to work in the healthcare industry in marketing for it was an insurance company or a hospital. It was a hospital, and this whole idea that her entire department was under this stress, always being in that quadrant one sort of mindset and culture. And it got to a point where her boss at a staff meeting had to yell over everyone and to be quiet. And then he said, 3 floors down, there are doctors performing brain and heart surgery on people. Are the emergency that we've created is not a really emergency. The work we do is not affecting the literal lives of people. And my supervisor brought that to her job at the museum, where he always says, there is no such thing as an emergency in the arts. We are not dealing with the health or lives of people, and we need to keep that in mind, that regardless of how urgent and important things might be, the fact is that if we take a little bit of time, a little bit more time, nothing else, like it's not going to damage anything. No lives are lost. No health is compromised.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things I try to bring into my work now, managing a small arts organization, because you do feel that pressure about grants or programming you get caught up in that. And so I always like to share that piece of information. Just there's no such thing as an arts emergency, and that sort of allows me and my team to sort of stop and go, okay, let's visit this strategically and not be so reactive.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I mean, I love that notion that work in the, you know, if we could locate most work in the arts in quadrant 2, it reminds us of how important that is. The reason you're in the effect of being in quadrant 2 is that everything changes everywhere else. Cool. Anybody else have any comments before we shift into a closing? Heather?
David, yeah, I'm just curious on some of the framework where the minute as an organization, you do think everything is urgent and important and that kind of work. I mean, that's why you're working at those jobs. How the framing of mission time doesn't create a groan, right? How it doesn't become this thing of, oh, now I got to put aside this urgent, important work I'm doing to have mission time because someone said it's time for us to talk about rubrics or do something else. So what's the lens that can be put on this that creates a positive frame to encourage others?
You know, Heather, I'm interested in how others respond to that too. I'll tell you just from experience that I think it's not a lens, it's an actual lived experience that changes people's idea. And that I did it at the Dodge Foundation through stealth, which is that I took our regular weekly meeting. So everybody expected to have an hour of weekly staff meeting. And I described mission time. I described what quadrant 2 was. And I said, we're going to take the last 10 minutes of every meeting and it's going to be mission time. And pretty soon it was the last 20 minutes. And then people started to say, could we just do more mission time? And you know, once they got the concept and experienced how helpful it was to them, they were huge fans. And if you took it away, they'd be very upset. If I had gone back to the old format of meetings, which was a bunch of reports and everybody spoke around the table, people would have been upset. They'd say, wait a minute, we're not spending time on important matters. We're only spending time on stuff that's right in front of us. A thought. Other responses to that? Other people who have done this? Mohammed, how do you, at Center for Whole Communities, how do you handle mission time? Can't.
Mohammed, you came off of mute, but you're not.
Sorry, I had my phone on mute. I'm also on phone. It hadn't occurred to me until you shared that story about meetings, David, but we have this practice in the beginning of our meetings called offerings. We just open up with a poem or a quote, something that speaks to the moment that we're in. And it occurs to me, it makes that point, which is like so much of art is about, right, important, not necessarily urgent, though the matters could be really, urgent. So I go back to that thing, is how can art also inspire this idea of a conversation and containing a conversation? I'm still stuck on that as form, right? Like, I want to rethink rubric as form, but art forms themselves can bring us into that lived experience of hey, this is a conversation that's, what is that Carlos Williams like line where, like, something about poetry, it does us no good, but people live and die by like what's in there?
Yes, that's right. Well, one thing that mission time does is it allows a little space for art and what it inspires. And so the idea, again, I go back to my Dodge experience. We had quite an investment in poetry and running a poetry program for the world. And we had poetry at every staff meeting and a chance to pause and reflect on it. What did we learn from that? I'm looking at the clock, and I'm gonna, unless anybody else wants to chime in, I'm gonna just do one. I want to do one last little flurry of slides. Here we go. So whenever I ask people, you know, working with them on formative assessment, on rubric writing and the like, and I say, what gets in the way of this work? Two things come up right away. Won't surprise you. Everybody says time. We don't have time to do it. And of course, you don't have time to do it unless you understand quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you have to, organizationally, you have to understand that there's no quadrant 2 at all unless you create it, name it, and claim it and protect it. Otherwise, it goes away. Same thing in our personal lives, right? We're all so busy that there are things that, you know, we say year ends and you say, I didn't read a book all year. Of course you didn't. If you didn't set aside time, you didn't protect time to do that. So mission time, the concept of mission time with leaders and living it and participating in it is the only way to solve this. But the other one is this resistance to change, which human beings resist change. And it's useful to think about why, because it helps to determine how we approach it. There's this change model that goes back, it's 50, 60 years old now, but I think I really think it's helpful. And it starts with this idea that the most compelling vision in the world is less than resistance to change. You could say, but here's peace in the world. And people go, they're not going to commit to it. So it raises a couple questions for us. You know, obviously in the end, well, what could be greater than resistance to change? But let's pause over resistance to change itself. I want to ask, where does it come from? And Robert Evans wrote a book. His context was schools, but I think this chapter about the psychological meaning of change is really so helpful. He says that people experience change in 4 ways. They experience it as loss. They experience it as incompetence. They experience it as confusion, and they experience it as conflict. Well, no wonder healthy human beings would resist change, because who likes this stuff, right? When things change, the sense of loss is the patterns of our lives define our lives, and you actually mourn for things that used to be. Lots of your busy colleagues you work with, if they've got kids at home and ailing parents, they don't want to have to learn anything new. They know what they know, and they feel a hard-won sense of competence in what they already do. So don't tell them to write a rubric. And confusion is just the fact that everything's related to everything else. You change something on Tuesday morning, Thursday changes, people go, what's going on? Could we go back to the way we were doing it? And conflict is, I think Robert Evans is very funny about this as he writes it, because he says that, you know, people we work with there's almost like our work family. And whenever there's a change, it's an invitation to surface any long-held grievance of any sort. So people are at each other's throats, and you're going, whoa, what's going on here? And you realize, oh, it's because, you know, 8 years ago, he got the office that she deserved. So it's helpful to know this and not keep it under the table, but bring it on top of the table so we understand what's happening. To go back to the change model, if resistance to change is that strong, then what does there have to be in addition to vision? We need vision, but it needs to be multiplied by something else. And Beckhart says it needs to have first steps. It needs to have a clear sense of what you would do next. And then he has a third element that I wasn't expecting, which is there has to be sufficient dissatisfaction with the status quo. Now, I go back to rubrics for a minute, because rubrics invite you in a very non-threatening and collaborative way to imagine what it could look like, to imagine what success could look like. And if you do that together, you're automatically dissatisfied with the difference between the way things are now and what you've just put together. This is Beckhart's change model. D times V times F, dissatisfaction times vision times first steps is greater than R. Okay, all right. What does that have to do with assessment? Well, effective assessment, rubrics, is a first step. You simply go home and say, what would success look like if we did this? And as you do a rubric and you do successive drafts and you be more specific, it sharpens your vision of what you're after. And that very visioning increases the dissatisfaction with the way things are now. It's not some external force saying you should be doing it differently. Our reaction to that is, what do you know? You don't understand my work. But if we who do the work are saying, here's how we wish it were looked. Here's what success would look like for us. It increases our dissatisfaction. And the very process of doing that together reduces resistance to change, because we realize we're in charge of it. It's not our knee-jerk reaction to assessment as coming from an external source. It's assessment as something we own and use, and the rubric is a tool for that. So bottom line, effective thinking about assessment makes change more likely, and rubrics are the best tool I've ever seen for an ongoing collegial, collaborative conversation about thinking about assessment. I would add one thing though. There's this change model, and I think it's missing something. I think it needs leadership. For me, if I were updating this, I would add an L, and I would just remind you that that's you. That's all of you. And leadership happens at all levels of an organization. So let me see, where are we here? We're 3 minutes from the end. And I moved quickly there. I hope it wasn't too quickly, but I wanted to have us all be able to look at each other again before we say goodbye. Any chord struck in that that notion about resistance to change, and then the sort of idea of how taking rubrics home could help overcome that?
It seems to me that that first step is almost needs like a power of two to it. Like the first step is, to me, the most important integer in that equation.
That's and it's interesting. It's really interesting that it shows how these are all related to each other. If you can take a first step that can lead you to a larger vision, then you can go back to first steps based on the larger vision. I'll tell you, Liza, that sometimes my first step with organizations, and I'm going to make it in the first person because I did it with an organization that I ran. I said, do you think we measure what matters?
Mm-hmm.
And then we had just allowed some time. That was some mission time. That's a 10 or 15 minute mission time question. Do you think we measure what matters? I've rarely come across an organization that says, we certainly do, and here it is. Almost always people say, no. We measure stuff like how many people showed up, as opposed to what our impact on them was. And that's the beginning of a conversation. So it's the kind of, Liza, first step that can lead you to a vision. And then if you have a rubric ready there to help people contain a conversation and advance it, and you've got leadership that believes in mission time, then you actually have a chance over time to change the way you go about things, and I think dramatically increase your impact in the world. We're right at the end. Heather, are you wrapping up?
No, I don't have a wrap up. Emily, I'm not sure if you have any wrap up. But I hope everyone took a little something from this. And I know every time I hear David talk, I take just one more little nugget away. And a lot of what David's saying, we're hoping is woven through Artists Thrive and that work. And I'm happy to have a chat at any time with anyone, even where we're going with Artists Thrive based upon some of this thinking and things too. It is a constant evolution. I think when we started on a path with a few things, we thought it was the right path, and there's some shifting and things we're having to do based upon the collective listening we're having from everyone in this. So with that, just thank you to David for being here with us, for sharing all of your insights and experience. Well, and thank you, Heather. Thanks everybody who joined us. I really do have to say, the Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation with Heather spearheading this effort has stuck with the process of rubric writing
for years now. It's the kind of persistence you need as people gradually get it. And they get that it's not somebody trying to ram something down my throat and tell me that I'm doing it wrong and they need to do it another way. It's somebody inviting me to join a field-wide conversation about how artists thrive.
We just entered year 5 of working on these rubrics.
Okay.
So, yes.
That's great. Thanks, everybody.